welcome members to the 13th meeting of the 2019 Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. Before we move into the matters at hand, can we please invite Neil Finlay, MSP, to declare any relevant interests to the committee, please?
Nothing to declare.
Thank you very much, Neil. Thank you. Okay, Neil joined us on the committee to replace Elaine Smith, MSP, and I would like to put on record the committee's sincere thanks to Elaine for all her hard work while serving on the committee over the past period of time. So we go to agenda item 1, which is for the committee to agree to take items 3 and 4 on the agenda in private. Item 3 is for the committee to consider its work programme. Item 4 is for the committee to consider its approach to the Representation of the People Act 1983 Remedial Scotland Order 2019. So do members agree to take these items in private? Thank you very much. Right, so we move on to the body of work this morning. Agenda item 2, Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill. And joining us today, very pleased to say, we have Jen Ang, Partner Director of Just Right Scotland. Thank you, Jen. Andy Knox, Principal Solicitor and Director at the Lanarkshire Community Law Centre. Thanks, Andy. And Lorna Gledhill, Policy Officer of the Scottish Refugee Council. So thank you, Lorna. So first of all, I think we're all settled. We're going to have some questions for the witnesses that we have today. We've got a few questions, but just unless they're directed just to you, you're perfectly entitled to come in. If you've got something you would like to say, just give me a nod and I'll bring you in, okay? And thank you very much for that. So to kick off, could I first of all ask, what is your view on the extent to which the provisions in the bill will support and empower the engagement in elections of people from other countries who live in Scotland? Is anyone anything particular like to come on in that?
Sure. Okay. So, so first of all, thank you so much for inviting Just Right Scotland to come give evidence today. I'm here on behalf of our Rethinking Citizenship project, which is about building a broad and inclusive idea of citizenship in Scotland. And it's initiatives just like this, as put in your policy memorandum, that we welcome, because it is about supporting and engaging the engagement of people who have chosen to make Scotland their home. It's really clear to us that people who choose to make Scotland their home should and contribute to our society as valued members should have a say in the laws that govern us all, and recognising that through extending the right to vote and the right to serve as elected members in our political institutions is a key way of empowering voices that we know have previously been marginalised and underrepresented. There is something further, and I don't know if you'd like me to hold it for later questions, though. There are some areas in which we feel the legislation could have gone further in meeting that goal. Would you invite me to comment?
Yeah, well, give us a wee bit just now, but we'll probably come back to that later as well. But if you want to give us just a small taster of what you've got to say later.
Of course. Okay, so there are just two areas that I wanted to highlight. One of them is in relation to the restriction on the right to stand for election, which is only with respect to people who have indefinite leave to remain. And there were just some examples I wanted to share about how that could be rethought, or how some of the reasons for the restriction might be dealt with in other ways. And the second was, and I think my colleague Lorna will probably speak a bit longer to that, how the manner in which the legislation stops short of extending the franchise to asylum seekers. And again, it was just to give a little more information about the reasoning and the consistency, to see if we could clarify. Thank you.
Thank you for that, because we will be coming further on in that, but it's useful to have a wee idea what direction you're thinking of going in anyway. So thank you very much. Anyone else, any ideas about support and engagement? Andy.
Thanks very much to the committee for inviting me along today. Lanarkshire Community Law Centre it receives funding via Citizens Advice Scotland to assist EU citizens in Scotland applying for settlement to regularise their immigration status in the country. And so it's really with the background of that scheme that's ongoing that I'm here today. I broadly welcome the bill. I'm speaking for Lanarkshire Community Law Centre, not Citizens Advice Scotland, before the committee today. And I think it is a way to strengthen migrants' franchise purchase in Scotland. I've got some more detailed comments on certain technical aspects of the bill that I'll maybe reserve for later. But I broadly welcome the bill.
Thank you very much. Ilona, would you like to say something?
Hi, so thank you, the third thank you you'll get for having us here. I'm from the Scottish Refugee Council. We work to support people seeking asylum and refugees who find themselves here in Scotland, rebuilding their lives. Much like Jen and Andy, we wholeheartedly welcome this legislation. We think it addresses a long-standing democratic deficit whereby long-term residents in Scotland haven't had a say in the kind of areas that matter to them. They are long-standing members of the community. They should be able to participate in elections like the rest of us. So baseline, we're very supportive. Much like Jen, however, there are some areas where we thought the legislation could go a little bit further. We have some questions around the kind of explicit exclusion of people in the asylum process from the franchise, and also some broader questions about whether the funding associated with the bill in the financial memorandum around political education and awareness raising around voting rights is sufficient to achieve the kind of overarching aim of this legislation to fully empower and engage new communities in voting and standing for election.
Okay, thank you very much. So you basically, you're looking at the significance of this in terms of citizenship and bringing people on, you know, bringing the population together actually when it comes to these important issues. Is anyone? Neil?
Could I pick up on the point you just made there about voter education? I think that's a really critical point. When I was a councillor in West Lothian, we had a team who were involved in voter education in the run-up to any election, and they won various awards for the work that they did, particularly youth engagement in schools and young people in college. All of those teams have gone in the cull of local government jobs. Is that something you're experiencing across the country, where that type of work that was part of the youth work or community education work that local government did no longer exists?
I guess I can probably only really speak to the sector within which I work. So if we talk about people who are refugees or in the asylum system, the organisations that support them are chronically underfunded. Basically, there's much more need than there is support available. And I think that's an issue in Scotland and also in the rest of the UK. So broad kind of things that sit around the edges of people's lives, which might be things like voting or political education, things that aren't considered to be super critical parts, do fall aside. Importantly, with something like this, a really exciting, forward-thinking, leading piece of legislation, the moment of enfranchisement, of involving people in political systems that they've been actively excluded from, is such a critical point to talk to people about democratic systems in Scotland, about how you register to vote and about what your vote means. What we would also say is that particularly for people who have gone through the asylum system or who are refugees, there may be additional reasons why they are maybe not so keen on political structures. Their experiences in countries of origin, experiences of flight, the experiences of the asylum system here in the UK as well, can give people additional reasons not necessarily to trust structures and systems around them. So not only is there a broad need for political education and work around information and education on voting rights and registration across the full population of people that will be newly enfranchised, we would probably say that there is also targeted need within certain communities, not exclusive to asylum seekers and refugees, but particular groups that may have felt marginalised in the past.
Okay, Neil. Yep, thanks. Mark, please.
And are there particular areas of Scotland where there's a really well-developed partnership approach amongst, you know, NGOs and councils to working with asylum seekers, or are there serious gaps?
Historically, because of the way in which asylum dispersal works, the large majority of people that have come through the asylum system are going to be in Glasgow. So the way in which the sector, local authorities and others, and elected members, I would say, work together in Glasgow is great. I think when we're looking at particular things around the franchise, there's some really good learning that could be taken from other countries. So doing some quick Google searches, you can see in New Zealand there's some really great, really accessible information about how voting rights work there. So there's downloadable, freely accessible educational resources for both people working with young people and with adults in education to talk them through what voting looks like in New Zealand. And other countries have expanded the franchise in this way, so it might be interesting to look at examples elsewhere. I don't know if others have experiences of broader parts of Scotland rather than Glasgow.
And I would just add to what Lorna says. So Lorna's focus, so the Scottish Refugee Council's focus is very much around asylum seekers and refugees, which is one subset of the larger group of people who migrate to Scotland. And in extending the franchise, you're looking at extending it to all people lawfully resident in Scotland and retaining it, or sort of retaining the promise of the franchise that the European citizens already hold. I definitely support Lorna's proposal that the extension should come with a programme of education. And I actually see this as a really positive opportunity to refresh that for all of our voters, but also to kind of rewrite it and along the lines, the inclusive lines that New Zealand has taken. And I think that in putting that out through communities and through local electoral registration officers, you're creating a more cohesive sense of who participates in democracy at the local levels. Because when I talk about migrants and European citizens and people lawfully resident, there are large proportions of migrants in other areas not traditionally inhabited by asylum seekers, like Aberdeen and Inverness, Dundee, Stirling and Edinburgh. And in these areas just now, we know that there is also a tension with our European citizens feeling left out of political processes. So I actually think that the timing of this extension and the training that can go around it could be a really positive message as well, both for the individuals who are gaining the franchise, but actually for the local authorities in which they sit, who will also kind of be taking in these messages as they have to adjust their processes.
Yeah, if I can just add to the point that Jen made, I think the policy memorandum is talking about 65,000 nationals that currently wouldn't be entitled would have the franchise. In terms of the spread throughout the country of support, I would really just reaffirm Jen's observations that looking at the European numbers, the number of EU nationals, they are, I think 50% are in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Dundee, and you don't have, particularly in Aberdeen and Dundee and Inverness, access to legal advice and support that you do in much more so Glasgow, but Edinburgh to a large degree as well. So there is a need there in the North East and in the Highlands and Islands that I think funding should be directed towards.
Okay. Right, well, thank you very much for that. It's very, very insightful, actually. It's very worthwhile. Yes, of course, Maureen.
I take your point that there isn't the same access to legal advice, although Citizens Advice Bureau are pretty good in Aberdeen, can't speak for Inverness. But what is the need for legal advice in terms of this bill?
I think that in general, advice about entitlement to vote, to register. The point made that sometimes there's a fear about engagement with the franchise from migrants in terms of distrust of the system, etc. So if an opportunity is given by this bill to other people who wouldn't have had the opportunity to vote, etc., or even stand for office beforehand, I think that it's important that advice is available so that people understand understand their rights.
Okay, we'll come back to this, I think.
Okay, thank you, Maureen. Thank you for that. Tom.
Yes, welcome. This bill takes a radical approach in terms of giving voting rights to franchise to residency as opposed to citizenship. and extending that right across the board to all comers, going way beyond the present Commonwealth EU citizen. What's your view of that, and what are the downsides of doing that? I mean, you obviously as organisations come from the refugee side, and it's all very positive, but there are some negatives in there somewhere. There's always unintended consequences. Just what are your views on it?
So, so I think I think you're right. I think that because of the context in which we work, I would actually see this as overwhelmingly positive. I think it's important to remember that there is precedent across. There's international precedent in extending the franchise in this way, and I sort of see this as a really positive statement on the part of the Scottish Parliament, actually, to bring forward the franchise within the powers it has, so to bring forward the franchise in regional and national elections. Just that this hasn't been done before in the UK is not an indication that it was a terrible idea, if that makes sense, to do. I think it's a recognition. It perhaps feels uneasy, and I understand this as a lawyer. It feels uneasy because in Scotland we think about the difference between reserved and devolved matters, and of course it feels uneasy because there's something new and different here. But this does fall firmly within the devolved powers, and it brings Scotland sort of further ahead and in line with the position taken in countries like Ireland and New Zealand. So this is about empowering people to vote and to stand for election when they choose to make Scotland their home. Now, Scotland hasn't the power to confer lawful legal residence or citizenship on people in the UK, but it does have the power over how it treats people who choose to come here, and it exercises that in other areas. We have a slightly different approach in access to NHS services, a slightly different and broader approach, for example, and more generous in terms of how we educate children in Scotland, so children from everywhere. And this is consistent. This extension is consistent with the differences between, for example, Scotland and England. To the extent that people see that there's a downside, I suppose the criticism will be that we've done something different to what's happening in the other nations of the United Kingdom. But again, what we've done is only to exercise powers within our areas, and to that extent, it's no different to a city or a local authority having a local programme because they feel their citizens should benefit or be assessed in a different way. I'm not sure that squarely answers your question, but that's kind of that's how I would explain it to someone if they were thinking about it critically.
From a purely technical perspective, there is an inherent tension, I think, between the provisions of the bill that seek to ensure that EU citizens will continue to have the rights post Brexit, if Brexit happens, and the EU settlement scheme. And if it works out as they are planning over the 2-year period, will mean that EU free movement rights are extinguished, and that EU citizens that don't engage and register with this scheme will lose their free movement rights. And there will come a point in time where they will not have leave to remain in the UK, but they are European citizens, and so that's potential tension there. But I think that's probably the purpose of the bill. So.
So carry on.
Yeah. Do you see a difference between the franchise in terms of local government as opposed to Scottish national activities? Because local government is a creature of statutes of the Scottish government. And the rights will take place in terms of altering quite substantial, or could be quite substantial law changes at national level, which may or may not affect local government level. But so there is a difference between local franchises and national franchise.
I couldn't make any comment on that, Jen.
So in principle, no, I suppose I don't. I suppose there's a role. I suppose there's a role in extending the franchise. Obviously, they're exercising different powers. You're absolutely right. But there's a role in giving people a voice at both levels. And there is something as well if you think about how migrant communities might have common interests across Scotland, just as they might have common interests within a local authority. It's consistent. It's consistent to extend it at the national level. So, for example, as Lorna has said, there's a very high concentration of asylum seekers and refugees in Glasgow. But that's not to say that there aren't, because there definitely are, asylum seekers and refugees, many of them dispersed in small numbers across other parts of Scotland. So, for example, in the very far north or in the east. And having that strong voice participating in national government is also important. I also just wanted to clarify, just to follow on from something that Andy said about retaining the franchise for European Union citizens and future-proofing it. I know that was a question you had. And Andy pointed out that the continuing uncertainty around Brexit and the rights of European citizens raises a question about how this would operate. I just wanted to point out, and I think it's a very arcane area of law, so something that we're excited about, not many other people. But the franchise as it currently operates, so it currently is extended to Commonwealth citizens and citizens of the European Union in the UK. It's drafted very similarly, right? So actually these perceived difficulties about how the status or the in-status of these individuals might be changed by Home Office and Westminster decisions elsewhere already exists. So actually this dynamic already exists, and it hasn't, as far as I can tell, been a serious issue thus far. It hasn't been something that's risen to our attention. So that tension that you point out, it's right to point it out, but I just want to say we shouldn't be too cautious or too concerned, because that's how the system already operates. All we're doing is we're levelling an inequality. So the franchise is available for British citizens, for Commonwealth citizens, for European citizens lawfully resident. So the only people who weren't covered were people from the other countries, like the United States, for example, so Canadians but not Americans. And it was actually to make that more equal, I think, that we drafted the legislation in this way.
Is that okay? Thank you very much for that. That was a good explanation there. Now, we'd move on to the numbers of people who would be enfranchised by the provisions of the bill, numbers of people across Scotland. And Maureen, you get a couple of questions?
Yes, I think, Andy, you mentioned a figure of 65,000, although I think, according to the 2011 census, it's 55,000. But that obviously is from the 2011 census. Given Brexit and everything, we're not sure exactly what it is. So what's your estimation of that figure? Is it a good figure to base it on, or is it not?
I don't know. I don't have any empirical data. I think the 2011 census is the last national figures that we've got. An indication for the committee might be that I think there was an estimate prior to the introduction of the EU settlement scheme that there was approximately 20,000 EU citizens resident in Scotland. And there has been, I think, approximately 30,000 EU citizens registering on the EU settlement scheme in Scotland. So that's a 10,000 figure overshoot. But the census is the last national reporting figures, I think.
So is it going to make a big difference whether we're basing the number on the 2011 census or needing a more up-to-date figure?
I think it would be useful to have a more up-to-date figure.
Just to clarify, my understanding of the estimate that's in the bill documentation, this 55,000, that's of newly enfranchised voters, which wouldn't necessarily include EU nationals at all, because they are already entitled to vote. This legislation is about continuing that right going forward. That 55,000 number for newly enfranchised voters, however, I would still say is probably lower than what it is in reality. If this is a 2011 census, you've got 2,500 people that have come through as resettled refugees since then. So even within that, you've got a bunch of folk, you've got people that have arrived since then. So yes, it would be ideal to have a more accurate number. Whether or not that exists is another question, but I would probably say that it's likely to be a bit higher, yeah.
Okay.
I suppose, sorry, just to follow on, you could source the data from Secretary of State for the Home Department. The Home Office would have figures for people that are resident in Scotland that have temporary leave to remain. I suppose you can account for people then moving within the United Kingdom, but the Home Office might be a good place to start for those figures.
I suppose what we're saying is there are other sources of data which could be used to bring a 2011 figure up to date prior to having the next census in 2021.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Maureen. Thank you. Tom, you've got a question which partly been answered, but if you'd like to ask your...
Well, no, I think I've covered the
You have
second
covered
one.
that already,
Yeah, I mean,
right.
it's really to do with the extension beyond EU
Yeah.
and Commonwealth citizens into the general French
Indeed.
progress, extending the franchise. I think I got the answer.
Thank you very much for that, then. And thanks for covering that already. Right, okay. Okay, right, we'd like to move on, please. Thank you. And outstanding asylum claims, etc. And Mark, if you'd like to.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about the evidence around how extending the franchise really helps with integration. I mean, particularly for, really marginalised people who are asylum seekers, refugees, considerable challenges there. So what is the evidence to show that has a beneficial effect?
Sort of evidence available to hand. I mean, the way that we would think about it is that political integration is a key or a core element to a broader strategy around integration, and we would see that it should sit well within the kind of positive and welcoming approach that Scotland has already taken around strategies towards integrating refugees and asylum seekers. Kind of right at the core principle of the New Scot strategy is this idea of integration from day of arrival, not day of being granted status. So we would see that granting voting rights to people in the asylum system shouldn't necessarily be linked to them getting their leave to remain, right? So if the logic is that your integration starts from day of arrival, then if we see political participation and integration as part of that, then your voting rights shouldn't be delayed until you get granted leave to remain in the country. I think the flip side is that if you exclude people in the asylum system from voting, it's another moment of kind of social disenfranchisement, right? So it's another thing that you're not able to do. And as part of our preparation for our written evidence and for today, I've been going around and speaking to different refugee communities, people who are still in the asylum system, people who've got their leave to remain. And that's what some people told me, the sense that day-to-day life is full of exclusions when you're in the asylum systems. There's things that you can't do, things that you're not able to do, and things that you feel that you're not welcome in. And a specific exclusion from the franchise in this relation would just be another way of doing that. So the possibility, this legislation, as I've said before, is really positive and progressive and has the potential to enfranchise this group. So I guess what we would like to do is just think about that a bit more and think about whether that is a possibility within the remit of this legislation. I recognise that's not giving you empirical evidence, but it's that is how we would see kind of political participation within the kind of broader kind of world of integration.
And again, just to take Lorna's example and then draw it back to our common experience, I just want to point out that these provisions, which have already operated in relation to Commonwealth citizens and European citizens for some time, have shown us that a number of European citizens, they have been entitled to arrive in the UK as students or workers. They register to vote, not soon after, and they become long-term members of our communities, including standing for election and serving very ably in local and regional governments. So It's almost like a piece of empirical work in Scotland that perhaps hasn't been done. But I think we can look at that example both as a positive one in which the system has worked up till now, and also we can reflect on whether now, particularly some of the stronger voices, so some of our standing politicians who have been more forceful in being able to bring the experiences of migrant communities to public functions, basically, whether that has been a positive contribution to including those communities in our work.
Is there evidence from elsewhere, from other countries that have extended the franchise of those benefits? Has that been studied? And
So a country which has extended the franchise to include people that are still in the asylum system is Ireland, where for local elections, the only test is whether you are ordinarily resident in Ireland, and that is both for voting and for standing in local elections. I'm not aware of any kind of in-depth analysis of how that's impacted, but from informal conversations with kind of colleagues over there, the sense is that it just kind of works. There's no real kind of criticism from people within the broader communities of people living in Ireland. There were a handful of folk who were in the asylum system who stood for public office in the last elections, which were this year, if I remember rightly. None of them were successful, but the sense was that that was a really powerful thing for the community of people in the asylum system in Ireland. It was a sense of being seen and recognised and heard. And I think without there being sort of written academic evidence on this, it's kind of obvious if people are seen to be taking office or seen to be participating within kind of political systems, it's a kind of indication of being present, being kind of part of something rather than excluded. And just going back to what people were telling me here in Scotland, that was another thing. People saw that their right to vote was a way of them indicating that they are here and that they mean to be here and they want to be part of communities. So there's a kind of a softer analysis, so to speak, there.
Perhaps I can just offer a very brief legal analysis for the committee. As a matter of law, provided the United Kingdom remains a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights, an individual's Article 8 position, the right to private and family life, will be intrinsically strengthened by engaging with the voting process. And so it has that effect as a matter of law of strengthening a person's right to a private and family life, and therefore when considering whether they should be granted indefinite leave to remain or further leave to remain, their position is stronger as a matter of law.
Do you see any practical challenges, particularly for refugees, in terms of what might be envisaged in terms of registration, documentation, that side of things to vote?
So the documentation that comes alongside the bill envisages that there will be no significant changes to voter registration as a consequence of this legislation. So whatever the procedures that exist now will carry through, and that will be what people who are newly enfranchised are expected to do to register to vote. Now, my understanding is that, and it's been a long time since I registered, but my understanding is that registering to vote is a declaratory process. You say X, Y, and Z, and then it's up to the electoral registration officers to either ask you for further information if there's things that they need to clarify. However, if there's certain things that you can't provide, such as proof of nationality or a national insurance number or proof of address, it makes it more likely that they'll come back to you for further evidence. And this is where we can foresee some difficulties, particularly for refugees that are newly granted in Scotland, where there's been reports from the Red Cross about delays in receiving your biometric residence card, which has your national insurance number on it once you get your leave to remain. Therefore, if you don't have that when you register to vote, you might be asked for the electoral registration officer to give more information. Similarly, if you're in temporary accommodation, for example, you don't have proof of address, that might make it slightly more difficult to register. However, there has been some really good work done around supporting people who are homeless to register to vote. There's a kind of different registration form for people who don't have a permanent address, and that's a really positive move. What we would ask Parliament and the government to think about is whether something similar, well, at least there should be some consideration of the additional barriers that these newly enfranchised communities, including people who are refugees, but also others, might face when registering to vote, and consider whether a similar sort of piece of work needs to be done around that, similar to what has been done with people who are homeless. Now, what we would also kind of advise is that we're really open to work with local government on this and help electoral registration officers understand what kind of documentation people might have, so we can kind of preempt these barriers and help people overcome them rather than wait for them to arise. So that's something that we're really kind of hoping we can do if this legislation does become law.
Yeah. Has there been any early discussions with COSLA or electoral registration officers or whoever governs them as to how this might work? Or
so we've had
still early days?
It's still very much early days, and to be honest, if the legislation does, if it's interpreted expansively as we would like it to include people who are still in the asylum system, then yes, there are some considerations about how those individuals will be able to register to vote, because they won't have a national insurance number, and we'll have to work that through. I'm not suggesting that it will be an insurmountable barrier, but it is something that would be a bit different. However, we've had very productive and positive meetings with the Bill team and with COSLA, and talked about working with registration officers. But again, it's one of those things that will happen even when this legislation becomes law.
Yeah, okay. I've just got a final question. I think you probably kind of partly answered it already, but do you think there are any circumstances under which people should be required to have lived in Scotland for a certain period of time before being allowed to vote? And I think, Lorna, you said this is from day one, like it's an enfranchisement in society, therefore this...
For sure.
But I don't know if you can see any circumstances where there should be a residency requirement.
Yeah, so we discussed this actually. I mean, I think really this is both more of a practical question than a kind of a principled question, and we also thought that perhaps in practice this doesn't pose a difficulty, and that's again looking at how the franchise operates at the moment. So the question should be, would you impose a residency requirement, and if so, why would you? So on what basis would we set a limit? So there are some, obviously the process itself has some core timescales. So in order to be eligible to register to vote in the next election, you need to have registered previously at a set period of time before. So there is a little bit of, in order to actually achieve the vote, there's a little bit of a timescale that's built into the process. Beyond that, what we thought, the practical problem of imposing a timescale is that you're then asking electoral registration officers, or that you're then actually pushing the burden back to the registration authority to now request evidence and assess that. And on what basis, really, given that the process is based on, at the moment, it's a declaratory process, as Lorna set out. And in so requiring people to declare, we require them, on their honour to tell us already their nationality, that they believe they are eligible to vote on these grounds and so on. So we actually think that package of voter education extending to, a good discussion with electoral registration officers about eligibility requirements, along with the declaratory process, should be sufficient. Otherwise, it actually becomes unnecessarily complicated, and if you were to complicate this, you'd need to ask why, basically. So what is the benefit of that extra period?
My observations, if I can direct the committee to page 9 of the policy memorandum, and that's paragraph 46. I think that sets out the intention and states that this newly enfranchised individuals under this policy would be required, as is currently the case for all voters, to prove residency in a particular local authority area in order to register to vote in Scotland. This will ensure that in most cases only those with a permanent address in Scotland will be able to vote, and that temporary visitors and tourists will not be able to register. And EROs will assess residence as they do at present for existing voters. So on the face of it, a person with temporary leave as a visitor or a tourist could register, would have the right to vote. But when they approach the ERO, hopefully the EROs have got sufficient training to establish that they don't have a permanent address in the country. Therefore, registration wouldn't be appropriate.
Okay. Tom, did you have a...
Well,
really sort of follows on from that a bit. I'm just worried a bit in terms of if you're extending the franchise, what are the rights and obligations, sorry, the responsibilities and obligations that might be beholden to the person who gets the franchise? I mean, otherwise you're going to get a situation where you're going to get two classes of citizens, those who have voting rights and who are just residents, and those who have voting rights who are nationals. And they have different responsibilities and obligations.
So, I mean, so the way I see it, I mean, I suppose the sole responsibility in extending the franchise is to exercise your vote responsibly, so to vote in an informed way. But I suppose if we stand back and we think about rights and obligations between the state and we think about citizenship, actually at the moment, non-citizens, non-British citizens who come to Scotland have a range of obligations to Scotland, right, by virtue of being here. For one thing, they're subject to our laws, right? So simply by physically appearing in our jurisdiction, right, they are... They have obligations around standards of behaviour, they have obligations around their conduct, whether or not they actually understand or are informed by them. The franchise, so the right to vote, is the extension of an additional right to people who are already here obeying those laws. In many cases, for example, and this is another sort of instance of, or another way of thinking about the right to vote, who might be working and paying taxes, so therefore contributing to the economic production in the country, and yet without the right to have a say around the conduct of matters. They might equally be volunteering and providing time and resource in our communities. Again, having a view, so keeping the street tidy, taking up caring responsibilities in our communities, and again without the right to vote. So it's not so much if we extend the right to vote, what are the additional obligations? It's actually individuals in our communities are contributing and already exist under obligations. And there is this kind of inconsistency. Some individuals, if by virtue of their nationality they happen to be British or Commonwealth citizens or Europeans, already have the right to vote. So it's actually just the other ones, it's levelling up that inequality again, who haven't. And I think the simple proposal here is to actually rebalance the rights and obligations in this case.
Is that okay, Tom?
Not entirely, but I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, Neil's coming in the back of it anyway.
Just in terms of, if we look at some of the, probably more relevant to the UK Parliament, but if we look at some of the very tiny majorities that some politicians are sitting on at the moment, is there an opportunity for this to be manipulated, even temporarily, in order to manipulate the results of in particular seats? You know, it only takes a couple of people to temporarily register in North East Fife for the incumbent not to be there any longer, potentially.
I guess it's an interesting point. I guess the potential for exploiting that already exists. I don't think that British citizens would be any more vulnerable, or it would be any easier to. I mean, you could say.
Not saying that at all. I'm not saying they would, but you know, I'm just talking about the principle of if you don't have a residency qualification in terms of any length of time, if you just need to register.
Yeah, that's already the case for lots of nationals. I would agree there's probably no more reason that manipulation would exist as a consequence of extending this particular franchise than it does at the moment. And it would be a sad case to not do something so positive just for that very unlikely scenario.
Okay. And hopefully the Electoral Commission would be all over that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Neil. Thank you. Okay. I was just You've covered quite a great deal actually about support for newly registering voters, new voters, particularly those that have recently arrived in Scotland. What about those, and this might be something which will come down to practicalities once such a once such a legislation is produced, but what about those without a working knowledge of English and explanations about how you go about registering and etc.? I mean, do you think there's anything in particular that requires to be done beforehand in planning stages?
I mean, at the baseline, it would just suggest that any documentation that is produced to support the extension of this franchise must be made accessible in its broadest terms. That's not just about language, but it's also about where this information is made available. If we're talking about, I guess there's two stages, right? There's a broader political education about this is how particular systems work in Scotland, this is what vote for X means, and this is what vote for Y means. There's understanding of the different political parties, and then there's understanding of how you register to vote, and then how you go about voting. So particularly with this legislation, we would say that there's a kind of one-off opportunity at the point of it becoming law, whereby you are enfranchising a bunch of folk overnight, effectively. And then there's a more long-term piece of work that needs to be embedded across other things that we do, be it within schools, be it within adult education, be it within broader integration work that we do at SRC. And all of these interventions must be considered in a way that make them accessible, and that, translating into relevant languages, meeting people where they're at, I would say. So one of the things that communities did say to me a lot over the last couple of weeks was like, yes, written documentation is great, but face-to-face conversations are the best. So there's something about kind of going into communities and speaking to people directly, and also the role of sort of peer educators, so working within, in our case, with refugee community organisations and representatives of those communities, upskilling them on how the system's working, how to register to vote, and then supporting them to go out into their communities and help people engage. And to say again, that kind of work needs resource, it needs funding, and it needs support. And I think that is unfortunately something that's not necessarily budgeted for within this piece of legislation, but needs to be considered as a kind of core part of how we make it meaningful to people. Because the worst case scenario would be to enfranchise a bunch of people and then it not really have any kind of real effect. So language is one consideration, but I think there's other things that should be considered too.
No, I think I've actually hijacked the beginning of a question that was coming from Maureen Watt actually, but she might want to go a wee bit further on what you've just been covering there. Sorry. Thank you, Maureen.
I mean, I think this is absolutely key to making sure that it's not just a piece of legislation, that people actually are getting engaged in the political system. So, do you think there's going to have to be a bunch of material written in various languages, for example? I liked your idea, Lorna, of peer support. If I think of any comparisons, like, getting people from ethnic communities to go on the organ donation register was very much about training up peers to speak to their communities at MELAs, for example. Not everybody's going to engage with the Scottish Refugee Council, so it's about a whole bunch of organisations who come together, for example, at a MELA. I don't know if Tom was there, but there was a great one with thousands of people there a week past Sunday in Aberdeen. So it's these types of events where people who might not engage with any other organisations will come together. Could be a stand, but there has to be peers there. So to me, it's organisations like that who should be getting the funding to have a stall at a MELA to spread the word that people are welcome and that they're part of the electoral system. Because otherwise, if it's, kind of other official organisations, as you say, because of cultural things, they might not take to it, if you like?
I think fundamentally there's a kind of role for everyone in this, in making this kind of exciting piece of legislation work in practice. That was something that came from communities too. They didn't see it, you know, there was a sense that people felt like it was also their own responsibility to get their head around it, and also for our organisation and organisations like ours to support them to do that, but then also for lots of other people to kind of provide opportunities for people to learn about the process and to register to vote. So I take your point that there's other spaces, and particularly like collaborative spaces, where kind of interventions like that can be really meaningful. Yeah, I think we agree to a certain extent. But it's about, yeah, I guess my point is that at the moment there isn't a consideration of where or how this necessary money will come from or where it will go. And I think that's a conversation we would like to have. It's not about necessarily taking it all for us. That's not something that we want, but it's about putting it in the places where it's most necessary.
Yeah, and one of my fears would be, I mean, I don't know how the budgeting was done for the figure that was arrived at. $250,000 seems a hell of a lot of money to me, to encourage 55,000 people, or 60,000 plus, to vote. So it is a case of these other organisations, no offence intended, but not big organisations, well-established organisations like yourselves, to get this money, but, you know, community groups within the different cultures to get the money to get this message across. And the other thing is, of course, that the people who will mainly be meeting voters are the political parties on the doorstep. And we're the ones at the front line knocking on doors and encouraging people to vote. So what sort of education has there to be of political parties and their activists to get this message across? Because they'll be the ones on the front line.
I guess my slight response to that is there's obviously the step before. People need to have a decent amount of understanding about how structures work to open that door and have a conversation with somebody on their doorstep. But I do take your point that I think politicians that are going to be engaging with effectively a new community of voters, there is some collaborative work to be done there to, I mean, maybe some of the stuff around accessibility of documentation might be helpful for elected members as well when they're doing their kind of door knocking and canvassing.
Yeah, it seems to me that cross-party will need to get in touch with them, local community groups. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Maureen. Mark, you want to come in the back then?
I think that is a challenge. I was recently door knocking in Clackmannanshire and came across Syrian family, and there was a lot of smiles all around, but it was very difficult. I felt it was very difficult for me to try and engage and for them to engage with me. So there's clearly more work to be done. What I was going to ask you about is whether there should be financial support for particularly vulnerable candidates coming from refugee communities, asylum seeker communities, to stand for election. I mean, we see this kind of support now for candidates with disabilities, getting additional support to stand in elections, and it's whether there could be a similar kind of approach, particularly around language or political education or whatever, which would help to level the playing field.
Okay, so if I could, I was about to defer to Lorna. I just wanted to raise a point again, and then actually, if Lorna has further comments about additional funding, I'd invite her to. So to the extent that there are programs to promote participation in our political processes through encouraging candidates to stand, and that is about redressing inequalities, then absolutely I support that. But one of the kind of disappointing aspects of the drafting of this bill, and I mentioned it at the start, and I now realise that we're about to finish, is that individuals, the only people who have the power to stand under this legislation are individuals with indefinite leave to remain, which excludes refugees and asylum seekers. So as it's drafted, the Syrian refugee family, to whom we've given the promise that they could live here for 5 years and then apply for indefinite leave to remain, could not stand for election. And I queried, and I'd be happy to follow this up in writing if it's helpful, actually. I queried the consistency or the reasoning for that, and it comes back to I'm not sure why we did that. My understanding is that there was a concern that if someone had a limited period of leave, so let's say your leave was going to expire in a year and the period to which you were elected was a 2-year term, that there was something inconsistent or odd about allowing someone to be elected for a period beyond which they might lawfully be in the UK. But I wanted to point out that, as immigration lawyers know, aside from refugee status, the longest period the Home Office will ever grant leave now is 2.5 years, and that's kind of unusual. But people will have 2.5 years of leave to remain renewed over a period of up to 10 years, at which point they achieve the right to stay here permanently. So in confining the right to stand to election to people who already are permanently resident, there are people who might have lived here for 7 years or 9 years lawfully and have every intention, and as an immigration lawyers we would agree, are highly likely to settle here, but who you're excluding from participating in this way. And I wonder how principled that is, because I thought it would be simpler to say that if you were in office and then you became unlawfully resident, that's simply the basis on which you require to resign. So just as there are other life events, there are other people who are elected for periods of time and who are not able to continue. So it would just disqualify you from holding office. A similar example, because someone said perhaps when your leave expires and you're waiting for further leave, technically, if your leave expires and you apply for further leave, you're still lawfully resident. So you could continue to work. This is how it works in employment law. You could continue to stay. And so doing this also creates an inconsistency with how employment law works. But even if you thought that someone required to stop an office for a period of time and come back, that is no different to a period of illness or maternity leave in a pregnancy. Basically, if we think about it like that, some of the concerns I think that were raised are not founded. So I know that was a long answer to a question you asked, but I just wanted to make it really clear, if you leave it as it is, refugees will not be entitled to stand. And I don't know if, Lorna, you had anything further to say about that point. I'm sorry.
By-election, where there was only 1 year left of a term for a council, or...
It's the prohibition is if you have limited leave, full stop. And that is not consistent with the treatment of European candidates either, because under European free movement law, there is no period of leave. So all the European citizens currently serving they're not prohibited, but the sort of the parallel provisions haven't been applied in the non-European context.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, thanks very much for that. That gives a decent answer there. I'd like to move on, please, to the financial memorandum. And Neil, you do have a question there?
Given that, I taught in schools in modern studies and taught the electoral system, and I hesitate to ask the panel to explain it in a concise way, because you might ask us to explain it in a concise way, and we would probably find that as well, because the system is complex, particularly the Scottish electoral system. So therefore, I would agree 100% with Lorna that face-to-face is really important, because people can then ask questions, and you don't get that from an information sheet. You just don't. So I'm concerned that if we look at, they're saying 280,000 one-off payment, of which 200,000 would be for public awareness. That would be for the additional cost of public awareness. That's only £6,000 per local authority. And if you take it to each voter, I think the target was 55,000, was that correct? You're only talking about over £3 a voter, so it ain't a big amount at all. So my concern is that, is this a well-meaning announcement that's going to flounder on the basis that not enough money is being put behind it in order to engage the people who allegedly we want to engage?
Yeah, it's the concern that we've already talked about, and I think there's the conversation about adequate funding, which we've already had a conversation about, but also about available resources. And this is why I would kind of direct the committee to look at what New Zealand has produced, and now that is not a face-to-face intervention, but what it does is it does provide resources to facilitate face-to-face interventions. So you have kind of downloadable session plans to work with communities about how voting systems work in that country. Now, that's a kind of quite a light touch financially intervention that could be used by smaller community groups quite easily to then work with individuals on a face-to-face basis. So yes, like the 200,000 for awareness, 200,000? Yeah, 200,000 for the awareness raising we don't think is sufficient, but there are not hugely expensive interventions that could be made which would facilitate conversations about political education and voting rights. And I think looking long term, what we would like to see happen is for political education like this to be embedded elsewhere in work and interventions are already happening within certain communities. For us, for people in the asylum system and who are granted as refugees, there's ways we can pull this into existing interactions we have with refugee communities. But, you know, additionality does cost a bit of money, and that's not just speaking for us, that's speaking for other people that will be engaging with these communities. What I would be interested to know is that 200,000, I think, is positioned towards the Electoral Commission to do this information and awareness raising work. I'd be interested to know what that will be, because it's not loads of money, but it can be used in different ways. If it's all sort of paper resources or online interventions, then I would be slightly worried. So I'd be interested to hear from the Electoral Commission exactly what their pitch is for how to engage new voters.
So I'm new to the committee, so I'm just picking up on a number of these points. So is there any allocation within what's proposed to local government? Or is it all to the Electoral Commission?
There is some in the financial memorandum to go towards local government, but my understanding is it's not for awareness raising work, it's for more the kind of practicalities of administering new voters in voter registration and on voting day.
You know, you mentioned things like downloadable resources and the like. I think that is inevitable that what you'll have is a very piecemeal, patchy approach that, you know, that there may be some organisations in some areas where that might, you know, that might work. I would think, given the list of priorities, particularly that councils have at the moment, then it would fall way down the list of priorities. And I think the finances of this just, you know, are concerning if the objectives of what's trying to be achieved are to be achieved. Then this type of finance no fit just ain't going to cut it.
Agreement coming from the panel.
I'll put the caveat that I'm not advocating that it's a sufficient sum, but maybe taking the your CLAC manager Syrian family to one side just now and looking at people with temporary leave in Scotland that are not asylum seekers or here with humanitarian protection. Because of the structure of UK immigration law, very often those migrants are highly educated people who probably are engaged in the political process and maybe don't need assistance. And so for that group of people, I don't think, in just my own experience, that you would need to inform them of their rights because they will know. But for the groups that you speak for, I think the funding should be definitely targeted there.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Neil. Thank you. Okay, we can move on to EU citizens and their rights to leave to remain. And Mark, do you have?
Well, I suppose the obvious question is, can we be sure that all EU citizens will be granted a right to remain in the UK?
Can I just say, no, we can't be sure of that. We can't be sure of that because because at the moment, the political settlement in Westminster has proposed a system whereby European citizens require to apply to secure their continuing right to remain here. And there is an end date for that entitlement. So there's an end date to the application process. So people who don't apply and people who don't successfully receive that leave to remain beyond that end date will become illegally resident and subject to the hostile environment. So no, that's the proposal as it sits at the moment.
Okay. And I think, we received the evidence that we've got 50,000 EU citizens in Scotland that have applied through that settled status scheme, but that's only a quarter of the number of EU citizens that probably live in Scotland. So, how do we ensure that all EU citizens have an uninterrupted right to vote that continues?
I think it would be very difficult because the Secretary of State for the Home Department has got very broad powers to introduce statutory instruments that substantially change the immigration rules in Appendix EU. I think you saw that just 48 hours ago, that a substantial statement of changes was tabled. And it's not premier legislation. It doesn't require parliamentary scrutiny. And so the parameters of when somebody should be granted leave to remain or when they will qualify for indefinite leave to remain can be subject to change at quite short notice. So I don't know how I think the Scottish Government's powers there are pretty limited because it's a reserved matter.
And so if I can add to that, and again, kind of highlighting this reserved versus devolved areas of work. On the other hand, as you know, the Scottish Government has been vocal in continuing to articulate to European people in Scotland its intention to continue to welcome Europeans to Scotland. And as you'll be aware, I think it was announced again in the latest programme for government, the Scottish Government does put money towards information and advice to assist the people, the European citizens who are here now, to engage with the settlement scheme process, and also engages with Westminster around the future rules, so the future rules for settlement. That money has funded the European Citizens' Rights Project. It has funded some of the outreach through the Citizens Advice Bureau, actually to which Andy's project is linked. And I continue to advocate for that money to go to, again, and this comes back to Maureen's point actually, that money to go to particularly local community organisations outside of the Central Belt, and organisations that work primarily with European citizens. So, the Polish organisation, the Spanish organisation, all of which is just about getting people the face-to-face support they need to make the application process that has been mandated by the Westminster Government. So I guess we can't guarantee, but the government has a piece of work in the next 2 years, and it's taken that up really, I think, to make sure that where rights are available, people get the support they need in order to achieve those rights, particularly the more vulnerable and at-risk European citizens.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Matt. Now, just for the official record, to acknowledge that committee member Jamie Halcrow-Johnson has arrived. Jamie had actually informed us that he would be delayed, but he is with us now. Now, mindful of the time that we have left, can I ask the guests if they have any views on the proposals to allow foreign nationals with an indefinite right to live in the UK to stand as candidates in Scottish elections and hold office following those elections? Is there anything specific that you want to add to what you've already given us?
No, so I think I managed. I thought we would have to finish earlier, so
Yeah,
I think I managed to.
You did cover it pretty well, actually.
I did. I think I managed to make my point, but I do think it's inconsistent, and also I understand that the immigration rules and this interaction is a very arcane thing. I'd be more than happy to kind of explain objectively, if it's assistance at another time, what I mean by examples of places where it seems inconsistent.
Sure. Okay. Well, that's very helpful. I'd like to thank all three of the guests, Jen Ang, Lorna Gledhill and Andy Knox, for coming along. You engaged very well with the committee, and thank you very much. Now, that brings us to the end of the public session of the meeting, and I'd like to ask if we could move into private, please. Thank you.